It all went down last winter, during a stretch of a couple of weeks when I was staying at my uncle's house just outside the city. His place had that distinct feeling of age, not abandoned or broken, but worn in a way that made everything feel slightly out of time. The wood floors creaked under your weight. The hallways were narrow enough to make you brush your shoulder against the walls, and the lighting never quite reached the corners of any room. It was the kind of house where everything technically worked, but nothing had been updated in years. The basement was accessible through a door in the kitchen, a plain wooden door that blended in just enough to ignore, at least at first. I hadn't planned on going down there at all. In fact, I barely thought about the basement during my first day. My uncle mentioned it only once, in passing, in that casual tone people use when something doesn't matter. If I needed anything, there were extra supplies downstairs. That was it. Nothing to suggest it was worth remembering. And for a while, it wasn't. The first sign that something wasn't right didn't come from anything I saw, but from something small and easy to dismiss. The position of the basement door. I remembered very clearly closing it the night before. Not just pushing it shut, but making sure it clicked into place. The kitchen light had been off, and I didn't like the idea of leaving that dark, open space behind me, so I made sure it was properly closed before heading to bed. But the next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, the door was slightly open. Not wide enough to be alarming, just enough to catch my attention. At the time, it was nothing, just an old house issue. Maybe the latch didn't hold, maybe the frame had moved. It felt explainable, so I closed it again and moved on. Later that day, while my uncle was at work, I was sitting alone in the living room with the TV on when I heard a sound from the kitchen. It was faint, something soft, like a light kick or a small object brushing against wood. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to pull me out of whatever I was watching. I muted the TV and listened carefully, but the house had gone completely still. After a few seconds, I got up and walked into the kitchen to check. The basement door was open again, this time wider than before. I stood there, staring at it, trying to reason it out. Air pressure, uneven floors, loose hinges, anything that made sense. I closed it again, firmer this time, making sure it stayed shut before returning to the living room. A few minutes later, the sound came again, the same soft noise. This time I didn't hesitate. I got up immediately and went straight to the kitchen. The door wasn't just open anymore. It was fully open, as if someone had pulled it all the way back. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a coincidence. Doors don't just move like that on their own, not repeatedly, and definitely not from fully closed to fully open in such a short time. Something about it felt intentional, even if I couldn't explain how. I called my uncle and told him what had been happening. His reaction was unsettling in its own way, not because he panicked, but because he didn't. He sounded completely unconcerned, almost dismissive, saying the door had always been like that, and that I could just leave it open if it bothered me. That response didn't reassure me. If anything, it made things worse. I knew what I had heard, and I knew how carefully I had closed that door. That night, I found myself drawn back to it. Around midnight, I turned on the kitchen light and walked over to the basement door. It was closed. Slowly, I opened it, letting the light spill down just far enough to reveal the top few steps. Beyond that, everything dissolved into darkness. There was a light switch at the bottom of the stairs, but I didn't go down. I was just staring into the dark, listening for anything. The silence was complete. After a few moments, I closed the door again and went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the house felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound. And then I heard a slow movement coming from below. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Something was moving across the basement floor. It would drag or move slightly, then stop, then start again. The pattern repeated, uneven. I sat up in bed listening, my body tense, but I didn't go to check. My uncle wasn't home, and no one else was supposed to be there. The next morning I asked him about it again. He didn't take it seriously, blaming the cold, the pipes, the house being old. But this time, I asked him something more direct. I asked when the last time he had actually gone down into the basement was. He hesitated, just for a second, before admitting that he didn't really use it anymore. That pause stuck with me more than anything else he had said. Later that same day, while he was out, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't want to go down there, but not knowing felt worse. I opened the basement door, turned on my phone flashlight, and started down the stairs slowly, each step creaking loudly under my weight. When I reached the bottom, I found the light switch and turned it on. At first glance, everything looked normal. Old furniture, stacked boxes, forgotten storage. Nothing immediately out of place. Then I noticed a chair. It was positioned near the back wall, facing directly towards the stairs. It didn't belong there. Not like that. There was no reason for a single chair to be set up facing the exact spot where someone would come down. As I stepped closer, I saw the floor more clearly. There were marks, scratches, and long, dragging lines etched into the surface. They started from a darker corner of the basement and led straight to the chair, as if something had been pulled or moved repeatedly along the same path. I didn't touch anything. I was trying to process what I was seeing when I heard a sound behind me. A small movement coming from the stairs. I turned around instantly. The basement door at the top was moving, slowly closing on its own. There was no hesitation after that. I ran. I took the stairs as fast as I could, my footsteps echoing loudly as I rushed upward. By the time I reached the top, the door was almost shut. I shoved it open and stumbled into the kitchen, slamming it closed behind me. There wasn't even a proper lock, but I pushed a chair against it anyway, just to feel some kind of barrier between me and whatever was down there. When my uncle got home, I told him everything. This time he didn't dismiss it. He didn't interrupt or explain it away. He was quiet for a long moment, then he just told me not to go down there again. I didn't stay much longer after that. But before I left, I asked him why there was a chair facing the stairs. He didn't look at me when he answered. He just said, "I moved it after I started hearing someone come up halfway and then go back down." I moved into a house with my older brother. The place itself didn't seem odd when we first got there. It wasn't brand new, but it wasn't run down either. Just one of those houses that had clearly been lived in for a long time. You could tell things had been added or changed over the years. Small modifications layered over older structures. Everything worked the way it should. Nothing felt abandoned or neglected. But there was a certain unevenness to it, like the house had slowly grown into something slightly different from what it was originally meant to be. The basement was finished too, not in a modern way, but enough to make it usable. There was a couch down there, a small TV, and shelves lined up against the walls with random storage. Even so, we didn't really spend time there at first. Not because we avoided it. There just wasn't a reason to include it in our routine. The first strange thing didn't even seem connected to the basement. It was just a sound. Late at night, usually when everything else was completely quiet, I would hear something faint, muted knock. At first, I didn't think too much about it. Old houses make noise. pipes shift, wood settles, temperature changes cause small movements you can't always explain. It felt easy to ignore, especially since it wasn't constant. A couple of nights later, I heard the sound again. This time, I didn't dismiss it right away. I stayed still and listened more carefully, trying to figure out exactly where it was coming from. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt placed, like it was coming from a specific point, not just echoing through the house. Next day, so I decided to go down into the basement while it was still light out. With the lights on, everything looked normal, just like before. But I started paying closer attention to the details, especially the walls. I was trying to figure out where a sound like that could originate from. That's when I noticed something that didn't quite fit. One section of the wall, near the back, looked just slightly off. At first glance, it matched everything else. The same paint, the same color. But the edges weren't clean. They were uneven in a way that suggested it had been altered at some point, like it had been sealed or covered up after the fact. It wasn't obvious unless you were really looking, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I called my brother down to take a look, and he noticed it immediately too. Neither of us said much, but we both knew it didn't belong there. There was no handle, no visible seam you could easily grip, just a section of wall that felt out of place. We decided to leave it alone at first. It didn't feel smart to start forcing something open without knowing what we were dealing with. But that night the sound came back again, and this time it was different. Louder. It wasn't a knock anymore. It sounded like something hitting from the other side. The next day we couldn't ignore it anymore. We grabbed a screwdriver and went back down, pressing along the edges of that section of wall, testing for any movement. After a minute or so, something moved slightly, not enough to open, but enough to confirm that it wasn't solid. We pushed harder this time, and the panel gave way. Behind it, there was a space. It wasn't a full room. It was narrow, enclosed, more like a gap between walls than anything meant to be used. It was dark, dusty, and just wide enough for someone to stand inside. When the panel moved, a stale smell drifted out. Old, trapped air that hadn't circulated in a long time. We used our phone flashlights to look in, expecting to see nothing but framing and insulation. At first, that's all it seemed to be. Then we looked at the floor. There were marks there, clear, worn patterns that didn't belong in a space like that. They formed a line, an area where the surface had been repeatedly disturbed, as if someone had stood there over and over again, in the exact same spot. It was directly behind where the wall had been, facing into the basement. That's when my brother said something that made everything worse. He pointed out that the position lined up perfectly with the couch, the place where we usually sat when we did spend time downstairs. From that narrow space, someone wouldn't be able to fully see into the room, but they would be close enough to hear everything clearly. Every conversation, every movement. We didn't stay down there long after that realization. We closed the panel as carefully as we could and went back upstairs without saying much. That night, neither of us went near the basement. We didn't need to talk about it. We both understood something was wrong. Later that night, I woke up again. At first, I thought it was the same sound as before, but it wasn't. This time it was closer. It was coming from the wall, right behind my bed. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing, focusing on the sound. There was a faint movement, followed by a light tap from inside the wall itself. Not aggressive, just enough to confirm that it was real. I didn't move. I didn't check. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, waiting for it to stop. The next morning, we went straight back to the basement. Neither of us said it. but we both needed to see that space again. We opened the panel, shining our flashlights inside. The space was empty. But something had changed. There was a small object on the floor that hadn't been there before. A plastic bottle. It looked recent, like it had been placed there not long ago. We didn't stay in that house much longer after that. We didn't wait for anything else to happen. This happened about a year ago when I was renting a small house with two friends. At first glance, just a regular place in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of house you don't think twice about when you move in. Everything felt normal, almost boringly so. The only detail that, if you paid attention, was the basement. It had two separate entrances, one from inside the kitchen and another door at the back of the house that led directly into it. When we first moved in, the landlord mentioned it briefly, saying the basement was mostly for storage and that we probably wouldn't need to use it. We didn't question it. At the time, it felt like a convenience more than anything else, and for a while, we didn't think about it at all. The first hint that something wasn't quite right came from the back door. Every so often, we'd notice it was unlocked. Not disturbed in any obvious way, just unlocked. It was a little enough to ignore at first. None of us used that door, so we assumed it was just one of us forgetting to lock it at some point. It led to the basement, which we weren't using anyway, so it didn't feel urgent. We'd casually blame each other, lock it again, and move on. It became one of those minor annoyances that didn't seem worth investigating too deeply. That changed one night when all three of us were home. We had been sitting together in the living room for hours, watching something, talking. We didn't leave the house at all. At some point, one of my friends got up to take the trash out. A minute later, he came back inside and asked, almost casually, "Why is the back door unlocked?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. We all looked at each other, waiting for someone to explain, but no one did. None of us had been near that door. No one had gone outside. And that was the moment it stopped feeling like a simple mistake. The next day, we decided to take a closer look at the door itself. That's when things started to feel more complicated. There were two locks, one on the inside and one on the outside. The inside lock was still engaged, exactly how we had left it. But the outside lock wasn't. It was open. That didn't make sense. If someone had unlocked it from outside, the inside lock should have still kept the door secure. The only way it could be unlocked like that was if the inside lock had already been disengaged beforehand. None of us said it out loud, but we all reached the same conclusion at the same time, and none of us liked it. That night, for the first time since moving in, we decided to check the basement. We didn't split up or take it lightly. We all went together, entering through the kitchen door. We turned on the light and walked down cautiously, expecting something. But at first it looked completely normal. The concrete floor was bare. The shelves held random leftover items, and there was nothing immediately alarming about the space. It felt like any other unused basement. But the longer we looked, the more small details began to stand out. We checked the back door from the inside. It was unlocked. That's when everything started to connect in a way that made the entire situation feel different. We weren't dealing with a faulty lock or forgetfulness anymore. Something else was going on. We went back upstairs and made sure every door in the house was locked. Front, back, everything. We double-checked them, more carefully than we ever had before. That night, none of us slept properly. We stayed in that half-awake state where every small sound feels amplified, where your mind refuses to fully shut off. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard something. It was faint, almost easy to miss. A moving sound coming from downstairs. It wasn't loud enough to wake someone who was deeply asleep, but I wasn't fully asleep anymore. I stayed still, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, pipes expanding, something normal. But then I heard something else. A quiet step. Not above me, not outside, below. From the basement. I didn't move. I didn't get out of bed. I just lay there, completely still, focusing on every sound. There were a few more noises after that, spaced out, careful. It sounded like someone moving around, trying not to be heard. That was the worst part. It wasn't random noise. It had intention behind it. Eventually, the sound stopped, or at least faded enough that I couldn't hear them anymore. But by then, there was no way I was going back to sleep. The next morning, we all ended up in the kitchen at the same time. No one spoke right away, but the tension was obvious. Finally, one of my friends asked the question we were all thinking. Did anyone go downstairs last night? We all said no. There was no hesitation in any of our answers. We went down to the basement again, all together, just like before. But this time something had changed. Near the back wall, there was a small collection of things that hadn't been there the night before. Or at least we hadn't noticed them. A blanket, food wrappers, empty bottles. It wasn't random clutter. It was arranged in a way that made it clear someone had been using that space. Not just passing through, but staying there, living there. We went straight to the back door. It was unlocked again. That was the moment we stopped trying to figure it out ourselves. We called the landlord and told him everything. He came over later that day and checked the basement personally. He walked around, looked at everything carefully, but didn't react the way we expected. He didn't seem shocked or confused. If anything, he seemed unsurprised. Then he asked if we had been locking the inside door. We told him yes, every night, without fail. He nodded, like that confirmed something he already suspected, but he didn't explain further. A couple of days later, we learned something else from one of the neighbors. The previous tenant had left suddenly, without much explanation, leaving behind a lot of their belongings. According to the neighbor, there had been complaints before. People had noticed someone lingering around the back of the house at night. We didn't stay much longer after that. We packed up and moved out as quickly as we could, not wanting to wait and see if it would happen again. But even after leaving, one detail stayed with me more than anything else. It wasn't just the basement, or the fact that someone had been living there without us knowing. It was something I didn't notice until the very last day, while we were packing. There was a vent in the living room floor, positioned directly above the basement. Out of curiosity, I stood over it and stayed quiet for a moment. And then I realized you could hear everything from upstairs. Conversations, footsteps, movement, clear enough for someone below to follow along without being seen. Which meant whoever had been down there didn't just have access to the house. They knew when we were asleep.